So today's lecture, we focus on the 20th and 21st century. It's the world we are still living in, and the buildings and the cities are all around us that are covered in this lecture. So it has direct, it is directly related to our current experience. Modernism, it's, the term more modern is hard to define, because ever since the Renaissance period, people start to use the word modern. So by using the word modern, each generation and each period give it a different meaning. But the narrow definition of modern or modernism, modern architecture, modern art, in the narrow sense, to our, to us who are living in the 20th and 21st century, started in the transition from the 19th to 20th century. So that is the direct cause for what we understand as modern in architecture. It started somewhere in the late 19th century. And that beginning was directly related to the architectural development in the 19th century. And of course, 19th century evolved, carried on a lot of ideas from the 18th century. So all those are relevant. And we have been talking about a few directions in architecture in the 19th century. One is the adoption of new industrial material in architecture, right? So we looked at, for example, the Crystal Palace, the Eiffel Tower, the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève, the National Library in Paris. So all those use the new industrial material of metal, right? Especially cast iron. So one direction continued in the late 19th and early 20th century modernism is the use of metal in architecture. While in Crystal Palace, Eiffel Tower, and the National Library of France, the cast iron as an architectural material were undervalued, right? So they were either considered as a pure engineering material or being hidden kind of behind those neoclassical facade. While in the late 19th century, there were some artistic movement who were very self-conscious about using cast iron and later using steel for artistic expression. So this is one direction continued from the 19th century, which eventually became one of the major aspects of modernism, of modern architecture in the 20th century. And the artistic movement promoted that idea is the Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau as a artistic and architectural movement started in Belgium and France. So from there, it was popularized throughout Europe. And in different European countries, it found different expressions. For example, in Austria, it became known as a Vienna secessionist movement. it also eventually reached America, and in America it became Art Deco, but it's basically very similar to the original art novel. So art novel use metal to create beautiful form. As you can see in this interior design by Victor Horta, the Tassel House, the interior columns are made of metal, but instead of using metal to mimic those Gothic column, it was trying to find its own expression. And in art novel, the adoption of cast iron was combined with a new design of kind of a vegetal floral shape. So those metal cast iron columns are shaped into those plant shape, developed into those organic shape to exhibit in the interior as a beautiful architectural form without hiding a material of industrial product, right? So art novel explored that dimension. As I mentioned, it influenced, for example, American Art Deco. So if you go to Chicago, you might find a lot of the high-rise on their lower floors, a lot of kind of metal, flowery decoration. And that was a carrying on the idea of art novel, right? So that is one of the major development in the early 20th century. So of course, you know, there is a whole course just to focus on 20th and 21st century offered at Northeastern. So it's a whole full semester. So in this class, we condense it into just one lecture. So we are not going to elaborate on each of these individual movement. So if you want to learn more, you can take the course on modern architecture, and you will look at different regional expression of art novel. But in this class, I'm just going to show you just one slide. Another, and that is one stage. That is a kind of an initial stage. And then there's a kind of an interwar period, you know, from the end of the First World War to the beginning of the Second World War, basically from 1919 to 1940, you know, though that few decades, you know, basically the 1920th and 1930s, those 2 decades are the age for the kind of avant-gardism in modernism. So during those 2 decades of peace between the 2 world wars, artistic and architectural movement pioneering the exploration of new form for a new world flourished in both Europe and America. And that is the kind of a avant-garde period of avant-gardism. And during that period, you know, if art novel represent the pre-World War I movement of modernism, during the interwar period, the steel represent a very important movement, exploring not only architecture, but art in general. So the steel, it is a Dutch word meaning the style, simply means the style. So what style? So it's looking for a new style, for a new century, for a new world. And the steel based in Holland kind of continued the 19th century ideal promoted by by Ruskin, by William Morris, etc., about the idea that art and architecture should be an integral part of life. And somehow the division between architecture, sculpture, painting, furniture design, so-called minor arts, are artificial, and their idea was to create to integrate art and architecture with life. So that idea is very similar to the 19th century idea promoted by Ruskin and the art and crafts movement by William Morris. So so the style has its own circle, and they have sculptor, they have painter, they have furniture designer, they had architect. They all work together. The founder, Van Doesburg, was both an architect and a painter, and so you will see a lot of these artists and architects. They also explore painting and sculpture as well as architecture, because that was their idea. The style represented that idea. And that style was not the only movement of interwar period promote that idea. Bauhaus also sponsored that idea as well. So it is quite a popular idea. So to some extent, William Morris, arts and crafts movement bear fruit in these interwar movement. So this is a building designed by Gerrit Rietveld. It's the famous Schroeder House. And for those of you who are familiar with modernist painting, you might immediately recognize those paintings by Mondrian in this building. So the style promoted the idea of integration. So architecture should not be significantly different from sculpture, from modern sculpture, painting, or furniture. So he used this planes and columns to make a three-dimensional composition and to incorporate space to be occupied as architecture. But in essence, it is applying the same principle for doing a sculpture or making a painting composition. And the formal quality, the style promoted is simplicity and abstraction. So in that aspect, it is continuing the 18th and the 19th century critique to artificial application of architectural elements. For example, as early as the 18th century, criticism was made to those artificial application of classical elements. For example, the broken pediments or the piling up of gables and cornices, etc. Those were criticized as not honest expression of structure and material, right? So there was already a criticism to artificial decoration, and the style movement pushed that to its extreme. And this is also, of course, true for those modern painters, for example, the Cubist painters like Picasso, who tried to reduce, the life figure to abstraction, use the minimal amount of depiction to represent, if not the lifelikeliness of the subject, the spirit of the subject. So the same idea was applied to architecture, in the steel movement. So architecture should be the truthful and honest expression of the structure and the material. So here you find columns are supporting things, and walls are enclosing spaces. So every element was meant to express its function, and this is expressed in this building. So another ideal of the steel movement is to kind of integrate exterior with interior. So the exterior should be honest expression of interior space as well. So in another word, what you see from exterior as the division of space. So you see there's one big glass here, and it
Does someone want to call him?
I got it. I was about to call you, Professor.
Yeah. I hope you can hear me okay now. That all right? You hear me? Good. All right. Thank you. I'm sorry for the disruption. Okay. So I think if we compare the window in the Schroeder house, we noticed that significant difference from the buildings we have been studying before. So a lot of the neoclassical building had been highlighting symmetry, and by doing symmetry, it does not necessarily mean the architectural space behind those windows are exactly the same. So actually, there are quite often the windows are very regularly opened on the wall, but the space behind were divided in a very different way. So, but here in Schroeder house, the facade reflect interior. So you have one room and elevator expressed by solid wall, and then another big window indicating the interior space like that. So you understand the interior space very well by looking at the facade, because the facade is an honest expression of those interior division. This is quite different from before. So another idea is that the interior and exterior should express the same artistic style. So indeed, just like the facade, and in fact, for artist and architect of the still movement, they wouldn't use the word facade at all, because facade indicates something that is just showing a face, exterior. For the still artist, the architecture there shouldn't be a division between facade and interior. A facade is a natural expression, an extension of the spatial expression. And interior is just another side of the same coin. And so indeed, interior using the same element, using the same kind of a plane and lines, and use basically square and a rectangular shape to make a composition. So there is a continuity between interior and exterior as well. So another element you might notice is the use of color. The still also promoted color usage, and is especially favored the three primary color of red, yellow, and blue. And then in addition to that, there is a white and a black. But when they use color, they like to use those primary color, red, yellow, and blue. And they are used on the exterior. They were also used in the interior, the same kind of primary colors. And color is a architectural element revived by the Victorian Gothic in the 19th century. And in the modern movement, color was adopted to make their own kind of new statement in artistic expression. Another interwar movement is called the Constructivism, originated in Russia. The Russian Constructivism explored the kind of engineering aspect of architecture. While in the 19th century, Crystal Palace and Eiffel Tower were not considered as architecture, were considered as only engineering work. Russian Constructivism made a very self-conscious effort to break down the division between engineering and architecture. And they call themselves constructors instead of architect, because for the Russian Constructivism, for an architect who is just drawing, not building anything, is not the ideal. Their ideal is to build. The same person who designed is the same person who built, and the design should not consider the architectural design as different from structural design and engineering work. So this is the monument to the Third International by Vladimir Tatlin, a major member in the Russian Constructivism. As you can see, it reminds us the Eiffel Tower. It used the metal, create a skeleton. And this is, of course, it's just a model for his enormous building. the building was not constructed, but it is just as advanced as an engineering work as architecture, because the solid building inside this metal skeleton was meant to be able to move. It is revolving, it can rotate. So he designed this kind of avant-garde architectural work deliberately to break down the difference between architecture and structural engineering. And this is a characteristic of Russian constructivism, right? Again, continued some idea from the 19th century, but emphasize certain aspect and try to make a very powerful statement about their artistic ideal. The most influential interwar architectural movement is probably the Bauhaus, because the Bauhaus was not only an artistic movement, but also a school, right? It's also a school. So through teaching, through education, it spread its idea to the next generation. And today, Bauhaus became the major model for architectural education. Before Bauhaus, the architectural education was called Beaux-Arts. That was the major architectural education promoted by the French court, and their design was mostly kind of neoclassical, kind of classical revival, as well as eclecticism, those representing those 19th century historicism. That was the main architectural education. So people under the Beaux-Arts education made Rome the holy land for architecture, and they visit Rome to sketch classical detail. So that was the mainstream education, producing architect that had been despising those engineers like Eiffel and Paxton. But Bauhaus during the interwar period provided a substitution to that education, and at the same time promoted the new idea that is much in common with the style, with Russian constructivism, etc. So like the previous two movements, Bauhaus also tried to disband the disciplinary boundary between architecture and other forms of art and crafts. So here, a group of artists, including architect, including sculptor, including illustrator, painter, furniture designer, they all work together, and they lead a studio and they educate students who specialized in some form of art, but they learn from each other. The idea was also to create a comprehensive inclusiveness in architectural education. And to some extent, they were also continuing the idea promoted in the 19th century by Ruskin and William Morris. And they also glorified medieval age, like Pugin did, because they believe in medieval time, there was no division between architecture and other art. So all are incorporated in the same great buildings like the Gothic church. So a Gothic church was constructed and designed as much by architect as by the glassmaker and craftsman. There was no architect. It's basically master mason. And so Bauhaus also promoted that idea, the kind of idealized medieval society in its architectural production, and bring it into modern age by incorporating the modern art and combine them with architecture at the same time, promoting a new form, even though they were admiring those medieval social aspect of architecture, they were promoting a new form, and they believe this carry on that spirit in the modern age. Just like the Gothic church used stone to express the structure of the Gothic cathedral, now we are going to use the modern industrial product of metal and glass to express the structure of modern architecture, right? So this is the Bauhaus school, the campus. The main building designed by Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius was the founder of Bauhaus. And during the golden age in the interwar period of the 1920th and 1930s, great artists work together, include Walter Gropius, who was mainly an architect. It also include Kandinsky, who was mainly a painter. It also include like Marcel Breuer, who is a furniture designer as well as an architect. So there were, artist and architect working together. Johann Miro, who is also mainly a painter. So they work together and trying to kind of use architecture and art to create a better world. That's basically their idea. And their building, as you can see, use the modern material of glass, metal, and concrete, and try to eliminate all those extra decorations and reduce architecture to its basic element, to its kind of to its load-bearing structural and functional element. And this is also quite in tune with the modern movement in art in general, that is favoring abstraction and favoring kind of a minimalist approach to form. So this is a model, and from the model you can see the kind of a modern architecture, their formal preference. Instead of symmetry, they highlight balance. So you don't have those exact symmetry. Instead of highlighting a facade and treating a building like a decorated box, they treat architecture as the enclosure of three-dimensional space, and the asymmetrical composition was a result of those accommodation of specific function and specific activity being housed inside, right? There are many movements in the interwar period. The previous are the three kind of artistic group. But there are also individual, very influential architect and artists who sometimes were affiliated with a movement, but more working individually as a powerful creative individual, like Le Corbusier. So he sometimes called his creation the new objectivism, whatever that means. But he did painting, he also did architecture, and his painting is kind of similar to those Cubist painting by Picasso, but Le Corbusier was more famous for his architectural work. So this is his Villa Savoy. Villa Savoy is such a classic. It is like a statement expressing the ideal of modernism. So very often we use this work to try to summarize the the value and ideal of the classic modernism. So sometimes we use the word classic modernism in architecture, referring to those great architects who became prominent in the interwar period of the 1920th and 1930s. So Le Corbusier was one of them. So he made the so-called 4 principles of modern architecture, and these principles are free plan, free facade, the roof should be the 5th elevation, right? So this is kind of a long principle. Basically, he was saying, the old building hide the roof, hide the roof behind the wall, or you only produce some kind of dome to be looked at. He believed that the roof should be the 5th facade, and the roof should be usable. The roof should be designed, and one should be allowed to go to the roof. The roof, there should be a roof garden for any architecture. The roof should be the 5th facade. So this is his another principle. And then finally, with free facade and free plan, window should be free. You should be able to open window wherever you need. So how did he achieve that? He achieved that by separating the supporting system from the enclosing elements. And this is something already achieved in the early high-rise in Chicago school. For example, Chicago high-rise was already building those high-rises using skeleton structure, using the steel frame for load-bearing structure, and then those walls are just curtain walls, right? So Le Corbusier make that into a principle, right? So you should have free plan when all these load-bearing elements are reduced to those columns. So you use column and beam to create a grid, to create a frame. Then the plan can be free. The plan does not have to start or limited by the grid of the column. And this is precisely what he was doing in Villa Savoy. So he created a grid of column, but the walls are almost totally irrelevant to those columns, to that grid. So for example, he put the wall here, and that is not on any of the column, right? The column grid is here. That is what he means by free plan. Separating the load-bearing frame structure from the enclosing element so that the plan can be freely designed to accommodate function. Right? So that's free plan. So that's this column called a pilotis. Now, with that free plan, since the enclosure is separate from the frame, then the elevation could be free, right? So those elevation are free. It can cantilevered out from the framework. It can recede back. So that's the result of this separation. So free plan and free elevation and a free window. So he especially promote those ribbon window, that long window, continuous window. So window is not interrupted by those load-bearing element like column or walls. So window can be opened freely. It can create those panoramic kind of long window as long as you want it to be. So these kind of a continuous ribbon window became a signature of Le Corbusier. It is also a signature of kind of modern architecture. And finally, the fifth elevation, meaning the roof, right? So here, the roof is designed as a surface for activity. So it's not just a cover, a shelter. It can be used. It is a roof garden, right? And it is also connected with the interior, integrated with the interior. You might also notice the similarity between the Villa Savoy and the Schroeder house by the Steele architect Whitfield, that the interconnectivity between exterior and interior and treating both as the extension of the other, right? Roof garden. And you can see that roof garden from the exterior as well, right? So that part, certainly it is a functional surface that can be used and enjoyed. Another very famous modern master is Mies van der Rohe. Mies worked with Gropius, for the Bauhaus education as well. Mies also, he's while Le Corbusier, each of these great masters also had their favorite modern material. Like Le Corbusier liked to use concrete, so his building used concrete a lot, right? Just all concrete. This is like their medium, just like some painters were some painters favor oil, some painters favor watercolor, some painters favor acrylics. Architects kind of similarly, some architects were more good at using concrete as a building material, others like glass and metal. So Mies van der Rohe explore the potential, explore the formal expression, the potential for formal expression of metal and glass. So this is his Barcelona Pavilion, and so he basically used glass and metal. All those columns are a metal column, cross section, but made of metal, and he used those marble to create those walls. Mies believed that space should not be divided into rooms. Rather, space is just space. Architecture is to define space to be used, but those space does not have to be enclosed by 4 walls and a door. So they can be interconnected. You can divide them. So he kind of break up the plan, as you can see here. So there is no room in the conventional sense. It's basically a bunch of enclosure and a supporting system. And in this case, supporting system and the enclosure are also separate. And to make that statement of that separation, he actually, you can see he leaves some space between the roof and the wall, right? So the roof is supported by the columns, and these walls are just enclosure. And he made that very clear by leaving some space between the roof plane and the vertical plane of the wall. So these share a lot similarity as well. So Miss Barcelona Pavilion was such a revolutionary spatial design that eventually it kind of liberate people's design concept for architecture. Now people realize you can have more free division of the space as long as it fulfill its function to provide the protection and privacy. So here, indeed, all those spaces are interconnected. So you find yourself walking from one space into another, and there is not a door, actually, right? So there's no door here at all. And of course, this is a design for the World Expo. It is not a residential architecture. The safety is not a concern. So he can design space like that, but he offered, opened people's eye, opened people's mind about architectural design. Now people realize space can be designed like that. Whenever it is appropriate, they have an option to design kind of a free flowing of space from one to the other. Another great architect is American Lloyd Wright. And so his famous building, he designed a lot of country villa. The famous Falling Water in Pennsylvania is probably his most famous work. So here, like the other modern masters, he treats architecture not as a box enclosed by wall and a roof, entered through door, but as a definition of space using those free composition of plane. There are vertical plane that can be called a roof or balcony. And then there are vertical plane that can be called a pillar or a wall, right? So those became free element. And this is the same idea the Steele was promoting, right? Designing architecture is like designing an abstract three-dimensional composition of a modern sculpture, right? So here it is designed with that consciousness. So we have this horizontal element, and in this case, this is a platform. It is also the roof for the lower floor, of course, but it is perceived as one horizontal entity. It is a balcony, it is a floor, it is also a roof. And then there are vertical elements. Here we have a solid wall. There are also vertical elements that are pure glass and metal. And there's vertical element that is called a chimney, right? So they try to kind of reduce architecture to its most essential element and then have a free composition using those principal basic element. So from the plan, you can see the same kind of a characteristic like what we can see in Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion. Architectural space, although this is a home, so there are doors, you have to go through the doors. There's a safety issue, but still for the enclosure, for the solid walls, there is a free composition. You have those walls dividing the space into different parts, but those spaces are interconnected, right? So here you have the living room, but then the other rooms does not have a feeling of an enclosed box. So you basically walk through some spatial transition into another space. So again, kind of the free flowing of interior spaces and the separation of supporting system from the enclosing that allow him to have those solid wall only at the place that require privacy and that is according to his judgment about the formal composition as perceived from outside. Right? So they can be composed freely according to artistic purposes, functional purposes, or whatever purposes. So they are not limited by those preconception about room, about window, about wall, about door anymore. And this is the section. So you can see the architecture is also integrated with nature very closely. Looks as if it is part of the landscape. It rises from the hill and sitting atop a waterfall, right? So the waterfall is flowing right under the floor, and actually there's a step, there's a ladder reaching down, hanging from above, that allow people to get as close as possible to that waterfall. So Wright's architecture had a great sense of, genius loci, the spirit of the site. So he studied the site very carefully and situate his architecture, seamlessly in harmony with the natural element. So, well, that is a very brief introduction to those pre-war development of modernism. And a lot of those great masters continue their career after World War II, after 1945, including Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, who both immigrated to the United States after the war. Le Corbusier continued to practice in France, and Frank Lloyd Wright also set up a school called Taliesin Architectural School, and had a great influence in post-war architecture as well. But post-war architecture starts to take on a new direction. I'm going to give you 5 minutes break, and after that we will continue and finish the rest.